Hello, You. Okay, sorry about that. You is a psychological thriller novel released in 2014, written by Caroline Kepnes. You is also a psychological romantic thriller that debuted in 2018 on Netflix. I recently read the first book in this series and thoroughly enjoyed it, so I thought, why not? I'll rewatch the first season of the show, which I also thoroughly enjoyed, and compare the two. I wouldn't say this is so much a comparison of quality, as I'd say the two are basically a match in that aspect, but they reach their level of quality in some slightly different ways. So let's discuss it. Spoilers ahead. Part 1. Joe Goldberg. I thought it made the most sense to start off by discussing the foundation for which both the book and the show are founded on, Joe Goldberg. Handsome, charming, empathetic, romantic. But enough about me. Joe in the show is actually quite likeable in this first season. Sure, he is a creep, and what he does is wrong, but the show does enough to counter the bad with some good. Joe in the book is an evil creep and I hate him. So why is that? Well, I feel the difference between the two is best surmised with the subplot involving Paco. This is completely made up for the show, and Paco, his mother, and Ron aren't even mentioned in the book. Joe going out of his way to help Paco and his mom, or being beaten up and facing trouble with the police, goes a long way to show a different side to Joe from when he's stalking Beck. This subplot, alongside the flashbacks to how Mooney would treat Joe in his youth, adds this extra layer of depth to his character, not found in the book. So what is Joe like in the book? Does he have any redeeming qualities? I mean, my copy of the book implies he looks like Penn Badgley, so there's that. The book's formatted to be Joe's inner monologue, so every time we hear his thoughts in the show, that's the entirety of the book. It's told in real time, and it makes for a fascinating read. Seeing this sociopath or psychopath, whichever, analyse the people around him, panic when Beckett is ignoring him, and talk himself up, only to become super self-loathing in the next paragraph, made the book so entertaining. But Joe in it is a character I love to hate. Truly, I can't think of one redeeming quality he has. I suppose he loves Beck, but look where that got her. His furniture is all stuff he found on the streets, and the lengths he goes to justify his actions make TV Joe look tame. Plus, the lack of the Paco storyline or much backstory from Joe himself, aside from parents bad and Mooney locked me in a cage, really make him a full-on villain. This is clearly the intention, to place the reader literally into the mind of a serial killer, and it works really well for the book. I'm just pointing out the differences between the two. When I'm watching the show, I don't really feel uncomfortable at any point. Obviously what Joe does is very wrong and inappropriate, but in the book, the way he would describe killing people is so disturbing. He's so calm about it. Even when he kills Beck, he attempts to justify his actions. It's the lack of any emotion, be it passion or anger, that shows just how twisted and self-righteous he is. It was very clever writing to say so much with so little. It is also worth pointing out how an actor and their portrayal of a character can influence how you perceive them. You is not a subtle show, and they obviously play with the fact that Mr. Badgley is indeed a handsome lad. But his performance is excellent throughout all 5 seasons, and season 1 is of course no exception. He's both charming and disturbing, romantic and empathetic. He does a great job at portraying Joe's bipolar nature, and he's a considerable reason as to why Joe is more likeable in the show. Honestly, I love that book and TV Joe are so different. It's truly 2 different iterations of the same idea, a hopeless romantic whose twisted concept of what love is takes him to the extreme. But whereas TV Joe still feels like a somewhat normal guy, considering everything, book Joe has literally nothing redeeming about him. He talks to his typewriters like they're his friends. Part 2. Supporting characters. You doesn't really have actual characters that aren't Joe in the book, since all we hear is his interpretation of them, and it's often an incredibly negative one. This only plays into Joe's obsessiveness and depravity, since he assumes the worst in people, but then idolises Beck so much, but then half the time he's saying terrible things about her. I'll be honest, I kinda see where he's coming from. Beck in the book, and again, this is just Joe's interpretation and description of her, it's not that likeable. It feels like she's just using Joe as a crutch for when she's lonely, horny, or just looking for someone to be a shoulder for her to cry on. Their relationship, if you can even call it that, is barely more than a situationship, where one half is completely in love and the other half still isn't sure. They know each other for 6 months total, but considering that, as well as the other 400 pages in the book, she's really not present for a lot of it. However, in that time, she does present some similarities to the show version. She's very loyal to Peach in both, she still goes to therapy, and she clings on to Benji when he is obviously no good for her. Her daddy issues also remain, but I'd say all of this is given much more depth and space to breathe in the show, considering there can be scenes without Joe in the show, so we literally get Beck's perspective on things. Peach was a real highlight in the show, and not just for the reason you're thinking. Her immediate distrust of Joe and love for Beck are in the book, but it gets really fleshed out in the show, and the antagonistic relationship that Joe and Peach have is so entertaining. I'd definitely say the non-Joe characters really improved when the jump to TV was made, but that's only because of the different formats. It wouldn't make sense to actually know Beck or Peach or anyone else in the book, because the book works so well due to Joe's perspective on things. Similarly, the TV show works in its own way because we see the world around Joe less subjectively. Honestly, it's really up to preference. But the book doesn't have Paco, so I'm leaning towards the show for having better characters. Part 3. Story. So we all know the story. Joe meets some hot lady and does anything he can to be with her and manipulate events to make her fall in love with him. You may have noticed at the start that I specified the show as being a romantic thriller, and that's because the actual romance between Joe and Beck is given such a focus. It's such an interesting juxtaposition, where we see Joe stalk Beck and kill for her, only to then see Beck's joy at Joe's romantic gestures, with this sweet and hopeful music playing. Since Beck actually seems to be happy with Joe, except for when she isn't, it actually feels like there's a love story taking place here. It's a horribly twisted love story, but a love story nonetheless. So compare this to the book, where we constantly hear Joe tell himself how amazing and handsome and selfless he is. We see instantly how fake it all is. Beck kinda likes Joe, in the sense that he provides comfort and he'll always be there for her, but they're barely in a relationship until towards the end. And even then, those chapters are pretty short, which was another clever writing choice. It's that difference between us seeing Beck's actual reactions to Joe versus what Joe tells us her reactions are. Beck's tone can, and undoubtedly is, misinterpreted by Joe to suit whatever narrative he has going on in his head. He thinks Beck is angry? She just is. He knows Beck must be so overjoyed at something he's done? She absolutely is. It's just whatever narrative he wants to play in his head at that exact moment in time, and it switches up so much. But by and large, the story beats are mostly the same for the main plot, just minor differences here and there, but it really is the Paco storyline that adds the extra depth as outside the main storyline. It was just as compelling as Joe and Beck's story, and it was sorely missing from the book, as someone who watched the show first. Add on to that Peach's distrust of Joe, and the episode with Beck's father. There's just more to the show, and while the pacing may be a bit odd at times, could have been a bit slower, it goes a long way to expanding the world. So, like I said at the start of the video, I wasn't looking to declare whether the book or show were better, because I stand by the fact that I believe they're at the same level of quality. Even the story beats are nigh on exact. The show is essentially a perfect adaptation, because it changes it makes for improvements over the book. I suppose in that regard, you could argue the show is better, but it's being placed inside the mind of a psychopath and being stuck solely with his perspective that I love in the book. It really is disturbing, and his thoughts feel real as you read them, like it's an actual train of thought that someone is having. So let me know what you think. Are you a big fan of the book or the show? Let me know in the comments. I'm sure I'll be back to compare Hidden Bodies with Season 2, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for that video coming soon.